I never thought that Sabine Hossenfelder would be someone whose video I would need to tear down. Imagine my surprise when I saw a video by her in which she tried to make it look like there was actually a legitimate case against giving younger people gender-affirming care. To that end, she cited thoroughly debunked studies as though they had an ounce of actual credibility and was dismissive of the overwhelming body of evidence in favor of gender-affirming care. So I did what I had to do and got together with Zoe Vexed to expose just how messed up that video is. And that is what you're going to see in just a moment. Hello, Internet. This is Sophia, the Red Angel, with another installment of Tearing Down Terrible Videos Together, where each time I get together with a guest, and together we get a video from somewhere on the Internet with really terrible messaging, and together we critique that video and expose what is so terrible about that video's message. And today we have a very special guest. Everyone, give a warm welcome to Zoe Vexed.
Hello. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, except that I saw a really terrible video by someone that I was not expecting to see such a terrible video from.
Are you talking about Sabine Hossenfelder?
Yes. And maybe she's showing her true colors, but sometimes someone's showing their true colors when someone you don't expect makes a bad video. Sometimes they're just doing a brain fart. But then there's also the issue that sometimes when they do just a brain fart, instead of standing corrected when necessary, they might double down and become a villain even when they were not previously one.
Yeah, I will say I don't think that she's necessarily like a bad person or anything like that. And it seems like a lot of the misinformation that she's talking about seems kind of genuine. But for my introduction, I am Zoe Vexed, and my channel name is the same as it's spelled on the camera here. And you can also find me on Twitter at Zoe_Vexed. Been on the channel before, friend of the show. And with that out of the way, I think we can get started.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. By the way, I have hope that this is just a brain fart and that she makes corrections and stuff. But then again, my hope is somewhat reduced by the fact of another video I saw by her on autism, which we might critique in the near future.
That'll be interesting. I wasn't really too familiar with her channel up until I started like delving into this. And the more that I've been going along, the more that there is a lot of stuff from her that seems a little yikes. Like you said, hopefully it's just a brain fart, or hopefully it ends up being like she just has some bad messaging with no like malicious intent, but only time will tell. And maybe this will be yet another person that ends up revealing themselves to be somebody who just cannot help themselves but attack minority communities.
Yeah. But anyways, without any further ado, let's get on to this video that we have today. As we've discussed, it is by Sabine Hossenfelder or Sabine Hossenfelder, and the title of the video is being trans a social fad among teenagers? So, ready to begin this dumpster fire?
Yeah, I like the provocative title. After we all already know the honest answer to this question, but I want to see what she comes to, because she comes to some very strange conclusions. even though I don't think she necessarily intended to. And she makes some pretty interesting statements.
So let's go on.
Should transgender teens transition? This rather personal question occupies a prominent place in the American culture war. On the one side, you have people claiming that it's a socially contagious fad among the brainwashed woke who want to mutilate your innocent children. On the other side, there are those saying that it's saving the lives of minorities who've been forced to stay in the closet for too long. And then there are normal people like you and I who think both sides are crazy. And could someone please summarize the facts in simple words, which is what I'm here for.
Toxic beginning to toxic video.
Right. We're already getting the both sides.
You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious and it was horrible. I think there's blame on both sides. You very fine people on both sides.
And I am very proud to be among the crazies that are out here supporting trans people, defending our community from junk like this, and also arguing on behalf of trans children, which is the specific target of this video. It is absolutely outrageous to me to compare people like us who simply want people to have bodily autonomy without the government interfering in their medical care, as medical decisions ought to be between a person and their doctor. And if they're a child, that's the child, the doctor, and typically their family as well. That's what we want, is equality and equal rights.
But also the family should not be allowed to neglect necessary care.
Right. And then on the other side of this, she's like, you've got like literal like people that want to deny us human rights, want to prevent us from being able to get like any type of health care. Like I'll go into that later because I'll start ranting on it. But it's just absurd to me to compare this. Like she's doing you could literally put the little meme where there's a Nazi guy across from like a trans person, and he's like, I want you to die. And the trans person is like, no, I don't want to die. And there's someone in the middle that's like, both sides are right. And it's like, that's her in this video.
But now you say you are proud to be among the crazies, but I'm sorry to disappoint you. I do not think you are crazy. Sorry
some
sorry
definitions, right?
Yeah, sorry to disappoint you.
Well, let's see how crazy this video is going to get.
The vast majority of humans are born with an unambiguous biological sex that's either male or female. While there are some intersex conditions, they're rare.
They're rare, but they exist.
Right. I love the fact. So this is a huge problem for her. A big crux of what she wants to argue is some type of biological essentialism. And she's trying to say the majority of people are born male or female, and that's it. There's some intersex people, but we're going to kind of hand wave that away. I want to point out real quick that some of the determining factors when we look at what determines sex, what is she even talking about when she says male or female sex, right? Some of those things are not limited to, but include phenotypical traits, chromosomes, hormones, internal, external genitalia, then some secondary traits like muscle mass, hair distribution, or breasts and fat distribution. This is not the totality of what determines your sex. But as we know, like a 101 introductory biology course in a high school, you might get this, it's male and female, and that's it, with some rare exceptions, but we're not really going to go into that. That's what your science professor says in 7th grade when they don't want to have the conversation about how convoluted sex actually is. And more research, as we've gained more information, we understand that it is on a continuum, right? And it is more complicated than simply male or female, because as soon as you start looking at all the different criterion and all the variations that it can present as, and the fact that some cultures recognize third sex. And it's not just male and female. It's male, female, and their third sex. It's way more complicated than she's presenting here. But the reason why she's doing this is because she wants to pretend that sex is so easy that, even children can get this with like boy and girl, and that's it, like male and female. But gender is the confusing thing. That's what she's trying to do. And if she were honest here, she would admit that sex itself is as convoluted and complex as gender identity is. But she's not going to say that. She just tries to skirt on past this.
Okay.
For the most part, biological sex in humans is fairly simple. People with XX chromosomes are biologically female, have ovaries and grow breasts. People with XY chromosomes are biologically male, have testicles and leave the toilet seat up. It's more difficult for some fish who can change their sex, but there are few fish among my subscribers, so with apologies to all fish who may be watching, I'll leave this complication aside.
Well, there are no fish probably among our subscribers, but there are, or at least were, transgender and intersex people among her subscribers. Are, or at least were.
Right. And when she wants to say that she's going to skirt over this and she's not worried about the fish, since she is defining chromosomes as like what makes you male or female, I'm just going to mention real quick Sawyer's syndrome, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome. All of those would totally explode what she has right here. The third options that she doesn't want to talk about because it would destroy this her false categorization here. It's not either like A or B. It's A or B or C or however other many categories you want to arbitrarily create to define sex itself.
Gender identity is as difficult as sex is simple. Gender refers to our internal sense of being female, male, or something else. As everything internal, it's subjective and hard to properly define. Gender identity comes about by a mix of genes, acquired biological traits, environmental and social factors, and cultural expectations.
Okay, so all the things that she listed that come about to bring about gender, a lot of those exact same things, because she mentions genes and genetic factors and that sort of stuff, and all of that ends up factoring right back into sex, which she just said was simple, and gender is complicated. So gender is as complicated as sex is simple, yet all the criterion that you just listed for gender and why gender is complicated could apply back to sex with very few exceptions. Even the culture, depending on how you look at it, as we mentioned before, with having like say third sex or two-spirit individuals, if you expand the scope beyond just this narrow Western view, you're going to see that like, yeah, culture can impact how people view their biological sex as well.
According to traditional Jewish teachings, you know how many genders there are?
What was it, like 6?
Yes.
Yeah. And
but
that goes
apparently
back, like,
Ben Shapiro hasn't gotten the memo.
Right.
And apparently neither is Dennis Prager.
It's very strange how like these people that want to talk about celebrating their culture and like maintain this kind of like foundational view of it, like they're fundamentalist, want to conveniently tear out the parts that disagree with them or that they don't agree with. And then when you say like, well, how come you don't want to preserve these portions of this culture? It's because it doesn't fit the narrative that they want to spin for how everybody else should have to live their lives.
Yeah. Dennis Prager uses the word Judeo-Christian as almost his catchphrase. Most Jews, however, wince at the term.
I also read a book called America, the Founding Myth by Andrew Seidel a while back. And I remember that stuck out to me as like, I mean, Judeo-Christian is nonsense as one term. They are definitely separate things. And the only people that are like using Judeo-Christian or that lump them together like that are typically like Christian nationalists that are trying to create this nationalistic unified identity between like Judaism and Christianity, even though, as far as I'm aware, Jews reject like Christ as a Messiah. That's why they're not Christians.
Well, thing is, in the early days of Christianity, there were Jewish Christian groups, but by the time Christianity assumed a recognizable form, those groups were gone. And
Right.
they were not involved in the Council of Nicaea. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the New Testament, both against non-Christian Jews who were blamed for being responsible for Jesus's death, even though it is very clear that he was crucified by the Romans, as well as against Jewish Christian communities who wanted to preserve who simply wanted to preserve Jewish culture in their communities. They got renounced as quote unquote Judaizers. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and it's abhorrent the way that the Jewish community was treated historically and still continues to be treated these days.
Yeah, because I mean, they're not saying that nobody can be Christian without being Jewish, but just simply they just wanted to basically to maintain the Jewishness of their communities, and they got renounced as Judaized. There's lots of anti-Semitism in the New Testament. It is the manual of cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
It is like the ultimate cultural appropriation. It would be very emotional if I were to start getting into that now.
Yeah, let's get back to Hossenfelder and what she's about to claim next.
The share of people who identify as transgender in the developed world is typically around 0.5%. For example, in the 2021 UK government census, about 0.5% of people older than 16 answered no to the question of whether their gender is the same as their sex registered at birth. The US Census Bureau did a similar survey in 2021 and saw 0.6% identifying as transgender. A 2021 census in Canada among people aged 15 and older saw 0.19% identify as transgender and 0.15% as non-binary. Curiously, though, the fraction is considerably higher among teenagers than among adults.
Okay, any thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, she's wrong about the percentages. The percentage of trans people is roughly like 1% to 1.5, not this like 0.5 that she's trying to claim. So like she's just wrong on that altogether. And as far as like where she's going to go on to claim that like young girls are just exploding with like suddenly identifying as trans, we have data to show that that is not true either. And I'll be glad to either post a link in the comment section, or I'll provide the information to put in the description of the video. That is not true.
Is that
at all.
part of the slides you sent me earlier?
No, this is totally separate. This is like separate entirely because people took a look at this very thing about like, are there more, young girls suddenly identifying as trans for some reason as part of like the investigation into, what Littman had posted. And it's not true whatsoever. She is wrong on all counts here. And I think she legitimately just doesn't know or isn't aware. I don't think she did this to be malicious. I don't know why she would lie about like 0.5% or something.
I don't either. So let's go on.
In 2018, the American physician Lisa Littman argued in a paper based on survey results among parents that the girls being referred to gender clinics in recent years are different from those of earlier generations. They show an onset of gender dysphoria during adolescence, but without prior symptoms, a combination that was previously basically unheard of. Littman dubbed it rapid onset of gender dysphoria and suggested that it's a case of social contagion.
So social contagion was literally like, as you mentioned before, has been weaponized against other minority communities, referring to us as like a disease, or, you know, rats or pests or whatever. That's what they're doing when they say like this is a social contagion. They're referring to trans people as if we are some kind of disease that is like spreading. This is everything that she just said is like Littman is an absolute disgraced researcher. Everything about rapid onset gender dysphoria is ridiculous. And as far as like these girls just seem different than the ones of the past. Well, how well studied was this in the past? And from when in the past are you comparing these girls prior to right now? And whereas previously, a lot of people might have misidentified like some, you know, AFAB people as just being tomboys or something growing up, and not realizing that they were trans, because some of those people might not even have realized that they were trans or that they were non-binary, because they didn't have the language to even discuss it. And it wasn't something that you saw like commonly talked about. Like, how rare was it? I'm an older trans woman, obviously. And when I was growing up in Alabama, there was very little information that I ever heard of trans people, what trans people were. The LGBT community was not represented very well at all. It's not surprising that people that I grew up with, mostly, if you just took a guess, you'd be like, well, I guess everyone is just cis het, because this information wasn't out there. And as I've gotten older, I've noticed a lot more of my friends and people that I grew up with have come out as being gay or trans or non-binary, whatever else. You wouldn't say that, oh, well, there were no signs that they were gay when they were younger, but all of a sudden they're just gay when at 17 or 24 or whatever. And yet we don't see people trying to make up these studies saying, rapid onset of sexuality, even though you wouldn't know if nobody told you. Maybe that
they weren't gay until they reached they weren't gay until they reached the age where people start being interested in dating and romance.
Right. And it's like, so that type of identity, it's fine for somebody to come out later. You're not like, oh, well, where was it in their childhood? But to put this like weird gatekeeping thing where you're like, unless they clearly had gender dysphoria as a child, which people that are on the right will say doesn't exist because they want it to be a social contagion, then why would you ever like, I don't see how they would get to this point where they can simultaneously believe that like kids are being transed and yet there are no trans kids, as some of them seem to believe.
Adolescent girls get the idea from social media or their peers or both and come to believe they want to be men, hoping it'll improve their lives. Superficially, the hypothesis makes sense. According to data from the World Health Organization, adolescent girls are twice as likely as boys to suffer from mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, so they're more likely to have a problem to solve in the first place. Littman speculates that girls that age are more vulnerable to social contagion than boys, though there's little evidence to back this up. Littman's paper was strongly criticized for not being a scientific study, but a collection of experience reports from parents. The parents were recruited among frequent visitors to websites who are skeptical that transgender self-identification among teenagers is genuine. This means...
When she says skeptical, she doesn't mean skeptical in the way of like, oh, I just would like some data on this. When this is like fourth wave now and stuff like that. This is like literally anti-trans websites. Like these people have an ideological bent against trans people. That's number one. Number two, when she says there's little evidence to support rapid onset gender dysphoria, there's no evidence to support it. Not a little, Hossenfelder, none. And if you're going to say that there's a little bit of evidence to support this, you need to provide the evidence. Then as the video goes on and she attempts to provide some sources to back this up, we're going to see why this doesn't hold up either. It's just weird that she would preface this with, there's a little bit of evidence to show that there is a case to be made. when she's already saying that Littman was disgraced. And the article, the blog that published her work, published an apology for this, because all the paper did was reach the point of getting to a hypothesis, because it wasn't a study of anything. It was a report of angry parents that hate trans people and what do they think of their trans kids. Not surprisingly, not pleasant things to say.
Mm-hmm.
Gender self-identification among teenagers is genuine. This means the sample is unlikely to be representative. Indeed, Littman herself writes in a paper that it's a descriptive exploratory study. She describes what those parents say. What to conclude from that is a different story. A paper that came out in August last year claimed to have found evidence for...
What?
How often would you... Like, she's supposed to be a scientist. She's a physicist, right?
Yes.
In what world would you say that, would you refer to a study that's supposed to be describing a condition or seeing how prevalent a condition is, and then say that my study did not interview or talk to or encounter any of the patients whatsoever with this condition, and I only interviewed family members that are all part of websites that are against, like ideologically against this condition even existing. Oh, what that? How do you even call that a study? Like, this is, it's an opinion piece. Like, you basically went out and just asked people that are like, I dislike, whatever, like, I dislike depression. And they said, okay, well, do you have depression? Let's not talk to anybody that has depression. We're only going to ask people about what do they think about people that have depression, and then call that a study of depression. Like, get out of here. It's ridiculous.
Or like doing a study on ADHD where you don't talk to anybody who has ADHD, who's diagnosed with ADHD, but instead talk only to parents of kids who is diagnosed with ADHD who are recruited through an anti-Ritalin website.
Right. It's ridiculous. To call it a study is laughable, and Hossenfelder should be ashamed for even calling it a study. She should identify it what it is. It was a junk article. It was an opinion piece by Littman masquerading around as science.
Well, the absence of this rapid onset symptom. However, this paper was also strongly criticized for severe shortcomings, such as, most importantly, for phrasing their survey questions in an ambiguous way and creative methods of interpreting their data.
Never mind bad ways of sourcing their interview subjects.
Right. Imagine if instead of asking people questions that, like, some people could complain are kind of vague, or that you might interpret the questions in a certain type of way. Imagine if instead of doing that, you didn't even talk to the people to interview them about anything. You just interviewed other people. Anyway, I will say that the complaint about this is kind of odd, because if you've ever taken any type of like psychological medical exam, you're going to notice that a lot of the questions on anything, when it asks you about depression or anxiety or your attention, any type of evaluation like this, because it's going to all be medicalized, some of the language of the questions are going to sound ambiguous or be difficult to pin down, especially when we're talking about something that's as subjective as someone's internal experiences. It's always going to end up sounding kind of vague. And that's why once you first start self-reporting these things, in most cases, if it seems that like you are leaning a certain direction with your self-reporting, you then go and do further interviews with a psychologist or with medical professionals to determine, like, do you actually need help for this? Like, do you have this condition, to confirm it? And to complain that the initial survey is a little vague is like, well, yeah, it's a survey of subjective experience. That's kind of what you would expect.
Questions in an ambiguous way and creative methods of interpreting their data. The brief summary of this controversy is that at the moment, there is no conclusive evidence neither for nor against the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, though it seems to be supported by anecdotal reports from doctors working in clinics who treat the children. The steep increase in the number of girls reporting gender dysphoria is, however, clearly evident in the data. Another issue that physicians...
When we talk about data, and she says this here, okay, she goes once again to say there's a little bit of support for it. No, there's not. There's no data that supports it. And as far as, have there been further investigations? So the publisher published a retraction apologizing for Littman's study in the first place because it wasn't a study. It was severely flawed. Other researchers have since gone and researched rapid onset gender dysphoria. And in their study, they provided strong evidence against it, in addition to the one that she already put up there, complaining about how vague the questions were. So we know that there are studies that have shown that as evidence against the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria. She doesn't like the studies, and she can get mad at studies all she wants to, but they are out there, and they were legitimate research that did show that rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a thing. On the other side, nobody's been able to prove Littman's hypothesis, and Littman herself has never been able to back this up with anything. And the fact of the matter is, this data was available to Hossenfelder because she made this video well after the study has come out, like years after the study has come out. So I know that if she did the amount of research that she seems to have done, she would have known that this has been thoroughly debunked. It is laughable that this is even a point that she wants to bring up. I'm sorry, but even if she's not being malicious, she is just being irresponsible here. This is very bad science communication. This is a junk opinion of someone that she's pushing to her audience as if this is legit.
Saint Carl is rolling in his grave.
Right.
By that, I'm referring to obviously to Carl Sagan.
Yeah, Sagan.
Gender dysphoria is, however, clearly evident in the data. Another issue that physicians have brought up is that many of the adolescent children assigned female at birth who are now presenting with gender dysphoria have other psychological problems too.
Okay. Who cares? That doesn't disqualify them from being trans. You could say well, a lot of these young girls coming in here that are identifying as trans or non-binary seem to be suffering other afflictions like depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. Yeah, if you are rejected by society, if your parents are members of Mumsnet or whatever forms that Littman went to pull her data from, we know that there are people and a lot of them have kids that are they just hate trans people. They pathologically hate us. And you can see we've been made this focal point of a culture war. And you can see it with the Dylan Mulvaney stuff that happened recently, where there's literally a boycott of conservatives of Bud Light for daring to have Dylan in a very short ad. When the amount of hate against us has spread to legislation, and it's basically ubiquitous in the current culture, when these young people realize that they are trans and that they are part of this community that is being so heavily attacked by people that might be like their parents or might be like their relatives or might be like their friends, or they're in a general climate that is so negative for their mental welfare. Yeah, I'm not surprised to see higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of depression, and unfortunately in some cases, higher rates of suicide.
Also, let's also remember that many of these people will see just normal variations of humanity, such as autism, as quote unquote diseases.
Right. You need to, you got to wear something to be cured. I would point out as well that she's well, doctors say this or think this, whatever. No offense to whatever anonymous doctors she's talking about. Where's the study to show that this is the case? And this isn't just some people's opinions, because within every single profession, there's going to be some subset of people that absolutely should not even have a license to perform their duties. Like when Trump rolled out that doctor during COVID, who had claimed that like demon possession or demonic possession was what was spreading the pandemic. That's not true. And that is complete garbage. But this woman was a doctor and she had a degree and she practiced medicine, and they were using her credentials to say, look, how do you rule out demonic possession? And it's like, I don't know. I feel like we have fallen so far from the days of scientific rigor and expecting to have good data to back up your claims, and that we as skeptics, that's what we want to see. Don't just tell us that you think that being trans is a social contagion or being autistic is a social contagion. You better bring something empirical to back up that claim.
Indeed.
Okay, so some people are making a lot of money with this. Does it at least work? Puberty blockers work in the sense that they block puberty. Side effects include, but are not limited to, weight gain, headaches, reduced growth, and a significant decrease in bone density. The effects of those drugs are often described as being reversible in the sense that normal development resumes once children stop taking them.
And of course, the effects of not getting these puberty blockers is completely irreversible puberty of a gender that might be alien to who you are.
Right. And I like the fact that she just makes this, statement about like leads to significant like bone weakening. When we have certain drugs, and I'm not a doctor, so always ask your physician. This is not medical advice for anybody, but there are certain categories of drugs that we can use to give to people that are undergoing this type of treatment, specifically bisphosphonates. And there are other treatments and therapies that people have looked into specifically regarding people transitioning. And the data does reflect that with certain treatments that not only do trans kids maintain a bone density that is close to cis ranges, but is below, that if they get the treatment while they were on this, then by the time they get off puberty blockers and conclude adolescence, most of their bone density is completely within cis normative ranges. She doesn't say that because she's fear mongering about puberty blockers. And there's plenty of data to support that puberty blockers are safe. And we've used it forever to treat other conditions like precocious puberty. There are hormonal issues, of course, that we treat with it. And they've also used it in a sense to treat, I want to say, breast cancer as well. There's a lot of different ways that we've used this drug before. There's tons of data on this drug and its side effects. Pretending like this is a new drug and that we've never used it before and we have no idea about it is just fear mongering. It's not true. If you need puberty blockers, you should have access to puberty blockers.
Indeed.
But this is the dangerous oversimplification. There are few long-term studies on people who have been taking puberty blockers, but those that exist show that bone density is unlikely to entirely recover, which means a lifelong increase of the risk to break bones. Other studies have suggested that taking puberty blockers increases the risk of heart problems and may result in genital underdevelopment or fertility complications. Though I have to warn you that at the moment, none of those studies are particularly conclusive because the sample sizes are small. On top of this comes...
So the heart thing, I have no idea what she's talking about. Like, I tried to find data on this. I spent some time digging into it. I couldn't find any. I don't know what she's referring to whatsoever. The bone thing, we have just covered that. And I'll say like within cis normative ranges, because obviously some people are going to have like more brittle bones. Other people are going to have like stronger bones. This is true with trans people or any other demographic as well. And I like the fact that she's just like, well, the data on a lot of this is inconclusive, but she's talking as an expert to warn you about this, because nothing about this segment makes it seem like she's saying that these are safe, or that the risk of the side effects of puberty blockers is so minimal that the offsetting the other side of it, which is how much it will improve a reduction in depression and suicidality. She doesn't mention that here, because getting access to puberty blockers and gender affirming hormones absolutely reduces the anxiety and depression that trans teens face, and thus is life-saving. If you weigh out having slightly more brittle bones versus a significant increase of self-harm or severe depression, like, it's very obvious that you would say, I'll take a little bit more brittle bones than I want to have severe depression that is going to lead me to possibly self-harm. She doesn't mention that, because that's not part of the narrative that, and I hate to say it, but at this point, I feel like this right here is starting to get borderline of, like, it's obvious that she is crafting a narrative to lean more right-leaning on this, because this is not that false center. Both sides are the crazies, and she's the reasonable one in the middle. She's only presented this with all of this negative stigma, all of the fear-mongering side effects, but didn't go over the benefits of them or present the benefits in any way to show that they absolutely offset this. Sorry.
Indeed. Oh, what you said is good.
Yeah, I know. I'm just rant over on that. Like, it was very frustrating.
Well, let's go on.
Particularly conclusive because the sample sizes are small. On top of this comes the psychological problem that not entering puberty when all your peers do isn't easy to cope with either.
And you know what else is not easy to cope with? Entering the wrong puberty. If anything, what this shows is that basically people are bending over backwards to accommodate the very few people who will detransition, and bending over backwards to accommodate them at the expense of the majority of trans people who will not trans. You see what I'm saying?
Right. They're worried about the possibility of the the less than 1% of cis kids that might mistake themselves as trans and start puberty blockers or whatever else. But that would be part of why you would have a robust system of gender affirming care to allow them to try pronouns, allow them to grow their hair out or start, wearing clothing that's appropriate for them. Let them talk to a psychologist and see how they feel about things, and monitor that as that progresses. And you'll have probably a reduced rate of detransitioners, which are already a fraction of all trans people. So they're worried about the less than 1% of the 1% to 1.5% of trans people. And if we went by the data that she wanted to earlier, that trans people only make up 0.5% of the population, then detransitioners would have to be 0.1 or less. You'd be way less than a single percentage, because you're talking 1% of less than 1%. And they're worried that kid is going to start transitioning and have to detransition. I get exactly what you're saying. They want to gatekeep puberty blockers, and they want to gatekeep gender affirming hormones for fear of what if the kid is wrong. And we already have studies, guess what, that show that kids identify themselves as trans when they're roughly even 6 to 7 years old, maintain that identification up through 10 years old. It was a massive study done on this, and we know that children are very able to identify their gender very early on, and it maintains. And guess what rate that children in those studies dropped out at of wanting to identify as trans, of realizing that they weren't trans? The fraction, the detransitioners, because they got their gender affirming care and they realized that this isn't for me. And instead of being forced into the wrong puberty and causing severe harm to trans kids, or refusing to allow cis kids that want to explore their gender to see what's going on, instead of letting them explore themselves and realizing, you know what, I am cis actually, and I'm comfortable with this. You're now delaying them in having that exploration until later on in their life, and you're stigmatizing the entire group for nothing.
But if anything, what she just said is, if anything, it's an argument for allowing active hormone therapy at a younger age.
Right. And I would say that yeah.
Because yes, there may be some issues with going through puberty at a much later age than your peers, but going through the wrong puberty is not easier. Just maybe let them go to the right puberty at a slightly closer age to when their cisgender peers do.
Right. And typically, like, already with puberty blockers, like, you might be like offsetting puberty, but it's only by a couple of years. And for a lot of cases, again, different for every individual, different for your own, your body's needs and everything else. But there are a lot of cases where, like, you can start microdosing little bits of the hormones at, like, 13 up until, that 13, 14, when you get to 15 or 16, where you end up fully switching over and start taking the full doses, like a regular regimen, to actually transition. And I don't know why her answer here is deny trans kids their healthcare, instead of saying we should just approach this subject with compassion and make sure that, children that have these needs are having their needs met and taken care of, instead of just like, wouldn't it feel awkward if you started puberty like a year or two less? I mean, that might make me feel awkward, but not as much as going through the wrong puberty did. That literally kills kids.
Indeed.
In 2016, the American Food and Drug Administration ordered makers of puberty blockers to add a warning about mental health problems to the drug's label after they received several reports of suicidal thoughts in children who were taking them. So clearly you want to have a good reason to put your child through this.
It's almost as though when you give somebody puberty blockers but don't stop bigots from constantly harassing them, they still have suicidal thoughts. It's right. Almost that.
And also with like nearly any medication, if you look at like taking, stomach medication or taking stuff for your, like Advil or aspirins or whatever, most of them all have like heart attack warning or liver bleeding warnings and stuff on them. Real scary stuff. Because if any one person in a study of a medication has any health problem whatsoever, including like heart attack or whatever else, that has to be listed as a side effect of that medication. And all she's complaining about here is that apparently when puberty blockers were first tested, nobody was having, like, none of that control group like committed suicide. So that wasn't a label. And it's only because all these people are complaining about it now that it's like that there is a group that is politicizing this to say we have to put a warning label that this might cause that. What's the causation there, right? All this is correlation and causation. They're saying that some people that take puberty blockers have committed suicide. Therefore, there's a causation that puberty blockers cause the suicide. That's not demonstrated. That's just people, once again, complaining to report of things to say this should be added to it. And for whatever reason, the pharmaceutical company listened.
I think it was the FDA that listened to that.
Either way.
Unfortunately, the evidence that puberty blockers actually improve the mental health of children presenting with gender dysphoria is slim. Some studies have found a small benefit in the reduction of suicidal tendencies, but these studies didn't have control groups, so the benefit might have come simply from receiving a treatment and being cared for.
No, that's not just so when she says a treatment and being cared for, she's implying attention. They got some type of a treatment and they were given attention. All right. This is once again her pretending to fence sit on this when she's definitely spinning a conservative narrative. Because when she was with rapid onset gender dysphoria earlier, where there's no evidence for it whatsoever, she's like, well, there is a little bit of evidence for it. And then in these studies, and by the way, there's plenty of studies with this, that determined that puberty blockers and gender affirming care does significantly reduce anxiety and depression and suicidality in teens. And now she's going to say, because she has an issue with all these different methodologies or sample size or whatever her complaint is, she's trying to sweep that under the rug and pretend that data, well, it's just so small, we don't really need to worry about it. But then on the other side, with rapid onset gender dysphoria, with no evidence, she's like, there is some evidence for this. So like, what is her standard for what qualifies as some evidence or a little bit of evidence or no evidence or bad evidence? And exaggerating this to be like, how do we know that these kids just didn't get attention? It's because trans kids that don't get healthcare and still have tons of negative attention end up faring very poor outcomes.
Other studies have found that puberty blockers given to kids with severe and persistent gender dysphoria had no significant effect on thoughts of self-harm or body image. The UK's National Institute for Health did a systematic review of the literature in 2020 and found that the results of the reviewed studies were of very low certainty and that the studies suggest little change with puberty blockers from baseline to follow-up in gender dysphoria, mental health, and psychosocial impact. They also say that, quote, studies that found differences in outcomes could represent changes that are either of questionable clinical value or the studies themselves are not reliable and changes could be due to confounding bias or chance, end quote. Let's then look at hormone therapy.
And that same study that she, in that very same study right there, which I can provide a link for anybody who wants it. If you go to section 116 within the study, it reads, data suggests that while children treated with GnRHA have diminished
Is this the slide you showed me?
No, this is just my own data that I had in the background. When I saw that study, I recognized the study and I pulled it up in the background. I just want to read this one point right here because she's like missing some of the point of the study, which of course she's misinterpreting it once again. It's not bone density, right? And it says that they have diminished bone accrual during treatment. It is likely that BMD is within normal range after cessation of therapy by late adolescence. That's getting off puberty blockers and continuing on GAH, gender affirming hormonal therapies. So once again, she's just misrepresenting what the data shows.
So I guess let's go on then.
Founding bias or chance, end quote. Let's then look at hormone therapy that replaces the hormones of the assigned gender with that of the chosen gender. This is usually done at the age of 16 to 18 or so much later than the usual onset of puberty.
So basically, the reason why trans kids who are given gender affirming care don't go into puberty at the same age as their cisgender peers is because in bending over backwards to suit the very few who will detransition, in order to bend over backwards for them, they do it at the expense of the vast majority who will not detransition.
Right, and then you're making them wait, like you're giving them puberty blockers, let's say earlier on in their teens, and you're making them wait all the way until they're 16 or 17 before actually giving them access to gender affirming hormones. And we know that like from 14, 15, 16, very often there is microdosing that already starts. And it's just that 16, 17, 18 might be where you can start your full regimen because they're trying to allow transition in the same way that your body does, or like at like 13, 14, 15, your body's getting some hormone, but not adult dosages. Then at 16, 17, 18, you can start on adult dosages, but she doesn't mention that here whatsoever.
When hormone therapy is later discontinued, some characteristics such as skin texture, muscle mass, and fat deposition are partly reversible. Others are not. Adam's apple protrusion, voice changes, male pattern baldness, and breast development are irreversible once developed. Yeah, once your hair's gone, even estrogen won't make it come back. Sorry, guys. The effects of hormone...
Sorry, guys?
Right. I would say like, right. She's being like literally transphobic here. And I can tell you from personal experience, like your hair does grow back. Not always, and everyone's transition is different. But I've known plenty of trans women who have had like hair grow back in after starting estrogen. And she's totally incorrect here. Like a lot of the changes that were made a lot of them are reversible, not necessarily completely, and not all of them, and not for every single person, but a lot of them are reversible. She is just incorrect.
Even estrogen won't make it come back. Sorry, guys. The effects of hormone therapy on fertility are presently unclear.
What I was saying, though, is a way that she said, sorry, guys. Sounds like she's misgendering the ones who would actually be taking the estrogen.
Right. Yeah, I know. I agree. I picked it up too. Like she's saying that like basically people that she sees as men that would be taking estrogen. She's like, well, it's not going to make your hair grow back if it's already fallen out. Sorry, guys, type of thing, where it's like she's referring to like older men that might be taking estrogen in her view. So yeah, she's being transphobic here, like just blatantly.
Yeah.
Guys, the effects of hormone therapy on fertility are presently unclear. Does it benefit the well-being of transgender people? Just a few months ago, a team of American researchers published the results of a study on gender-affirming hormone therapy in adolescents. They followed 315 transgender and non-binary participants aged 12 to 20 for 2 years. In the abstract, they claim they found an increase in reported appearance congruence, that is, how well the participants felt their gender aligned with their appearance, positive affect, and life satisfaction. They also found a decrease of depression and anxiety symptoms. These decreases are statistically significant, but that doesn't mean they're large. Life satisfaction...
They're significant, but not large.
Yeah, if only you had any of this stuff for your precious rapid onset gender dysphoria that you wanted to argue for earlier, or to pretend there was some evidence for it. If only you had, significant statistical variables for that. But then she's once again going to be like, well, this doesn't matter. Like there's a trend that I'm noticing here. And that's that any data that disagrees with her, she tries to minimize it and just dismissively hand wave it and say, well, it's just a little bit of data. It's just a little bit of data. Then any of the data that would make the point that she wants to make doesn't exist, or it's data that shows something completely different. And this is embarrassing that somebody that works in science would notice that when we have study after study after study that is reflecting the same pattern of things, it doesn't matter if it's like, well, there's a little bit of data here, a little bit of data here. When you do meta studies and you look across, 55, 60 studies, and you still see all of the same data being reflected back at you, you're like, okay, this is definitely statistically relevant. We know that from doing meta studies and all of this stuff, that this small amount of data that she's like trying to hand wave away, it absolutely shows up over and over again that allowing trans people to transition and giving them gender affirming care does in fact reduce depression, suicidality, and gives us better outcome with our lives, including, having less incongruence with your internal identity and your external presentation.
Indeed.
These are statistically significant, but that doesn't mean they're large. Life satisfaction, for example, increased by 2.3 points per year on a 100-point scale, and depression scores decreased by 1.3 points per year on a 63-point scale. You might say that's better than nothing, but these numbers in and of themselves don't tell you anything because the study didn't have a control group. Many previous studies have found that life satisfaction in this age group on average declines, which makes you think they either had a non-representative sample to begin with, or the fact of being treated itself had a positive effect. If you look closer at their data, it also turns out that the researchers only saw the psychological improvements for anxiety, depression, and life satisfaction among those designed female at birth, but not among those designed male at birth, a fact that, interestingly enough, isn't mentioned in the abstract. The authors speculate that the reason may be that they only followed the participants for 2 years, but it usually takes longer for trans girls to grow breasts of a decent size. So maybe it just takes longer for the benefits to become apparent. They also point out that social acceptance of trans women and trans men is different. Maybe that's the right explanation, or maybe not. As we've seen previously, young women on average suffer from...
What? I heard that.
No, this is ridiculous because she's like, oh, well, they only did the study for 2 years and the numbers, look significant, but, it's not. If you extended the data out and it kept going at the trajectory that's going, yeah, these people overall are going to be much happier and have less depression, anxiety, whatever else. I don't like that. She can just look at the chart that is showing an increase in well-being and a decrease in harmful psychological effects. And then she complains that, well, it only looked at these specific harms. Okay. I mean, if she wants to go and find someone else to do a more thorough study, I'm sure she'll be more than satisfied because all the data, every single time these types of studies are done, find that trans people are happier and more satisfied, have better well-being when they are given gender-affirming care. And the harmful things toward us decrease as we get that same care. I noticed that she also has never brought up social stigma, has never brought up, the way that a culture war has been levied against us. She doesn't talk about anything else other than what she specifically would want in the study, like other health concerns. Like, well, they didn't show the other health concerns, implying what? That our heart is bad or something, because she made that claim earlier, or implying that our bone density is worse off. I'm guessing that's what she's getting at because that's what she's mentioned in her video before. Otherwise, I don't know what other, medical issues she's even looking for. I don't know what her complaint is. Sorry.
Or maybe not. As we've seen previously, young women on average suffer from more mental health problems than boys. And the 2019 meta-analysis of 27 randomized placebo-controlled trials found that testosterone treatment is associated with a significant reduction in depressive symptoms in men. So maybe the hormones did it, but does it have anything to do with a gender transition? Another issue pointed out by
hormone therapy would be part of gender transition, now wouldn't it?
Not in every case, but in most cases, yes.
Right. And she's like, well, maybe the hormones did it, but how do we know that gender-affirming care did it? Well, I mean, typically, hormones are part of that. Not for everyone. Everyone's transition is different, but typically, it's part of it. So that would be considered part of the gender-affirming care.
Yeah.
Does it have anything to do with a gender transition? Another issue pointed out by Jesse Singer is that the variables analyzed in the paper are not those they'd said they'd analyze in the pre-registered protocol. This means they had an opportunity to cherry-pick their results, which makes their measure of statistical significance obsolete. I'm not...
Pure speculation. She's just saying this could have happened, not that she has any evidence that that is what happened, or that there's any other data that leaked or anything else came out from any of these people doing the study. There's no whistleblower on it. She's just speculating, well, maybe they cherry picked the data. I guess we'll never know. You can just make up whatever you want to.
But since they didn't adhere to the protocol, which they themselves pre-registered, it's a possibility that their results are just random noise. Another paper that is often presented by people favoring hormone treatment is one that was published in 2022 in the journal Pediatrics. They followed about 100 young Americans that were either transgender or non-binary, or at least they tried. By the end of the trial, only 64 were left. So we're talking about a really small sample. About 2/3 of the participants began a therapy either with puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones during the trial. The remainder served as a control group. The researchers observed 60% lower odds of depression and 73% lower odds of suicidal thoughts among youths who had initiated puberty blockers or hormone therapy compared with those who had not. They saw no effect for anxiety. In case that sounds good, here's the fine print.
Right.
The mental health of...
All right. So you can look at the chart right here. I'm glad that she has the chart handy for us. We don't even have to pull up the slide. So she's going to state in a second that there's only this little number on the end that is 7. You can go ahead and just play it and let her. I just don't want the chart to fall off. I want to point this out real fast. The number on the end is 7. She's going to circle it in just a moment. And that's at 12 months. All right. Notice that there's a 6 months and there's a 3 months and there's baseline columns listed. So that's at 12 months. There was 7 left in the control. Look at 6 months and you can see that the number is 24. Look at 3 months. The number goes up, then back to baseline where we're back to like 93. So there is a control there. And you can see that as they're getting their care, as they're going from the none column, moving into the puberty blocker / gender affirming hormones, that's where the depression is reducing, the suicidality reducing by 70%, and people are improving. That's how she's misrepresenting this. You can clearly read the chart right there, and it doesn't say what she says. And once again, this is literally, this might as well be like the old man yelling at clouds meme. She might as well be standing on the ground looking at like a sky full of data, full of studies, and just yelling at them because they all disagree with her. And this is like very typical. The amount of evidence on behalf of gender affirming care is mountainous. It's overwhelming. And she could go through each single paper and complain and complain and complain that whatever meticulous issue she wants to like pick at. And the fact is, like, you can do this with like just about any paper. You can always find some reason to critique it. However, the results are what matters. And the results every single time end up affirming that we ought to give people access to gender affirming care and that this helps people. She doesn't see that, and that's unfortunate.
Those who were treated did not improve. What happened instead is that the mental health of those who were not treated got worse.
But still, it sounds to me like the ones who were treated did better than the ones who weren't treated. Sounds like not treating is harmful.
Right. It's like, oh, well, if we treat them, they maintain their mental health. If we don't treat them, their mental health gets way worse.
How's that an argument against treating them? But how is that not an argument for treating them?
Right, because she wants to point to the little 7 at the very end of it, pretend like she doesn't understand how to read this data, and just say that, you know, there's no control group, that it was too small.
Yeah. And in the end, the untreated control group totaled 7 people.
After people who were, after a long period of time, when people who were not being treated, instead of staying with the study, went to get treatment because they desperately needed it.
Right. And you can see, like, once again, in the 6-month column, there is way more than 7. There was 24 there. And then before then, 30 something, before then 90 something. So like the 7 that she's circling is just her trying to once again dismiss data.
I know as a particle physicist, I may be used to unreasonably high standards of statistical significance and sample size.
Yes, you are. And here's the thing is that if you want to be a science communicator who communicates in areas of science outside your field of specialty, you need to do a little bit better as far as cross-disciplinary scientific literacy. You cannot be interpreting data in the field of psychology as though it were data in physics. That's not being a good science communicator.
Right, especially because if you think about in physics, whether it's particles or whatever else, right? You're talking, we have like septillions upon septillions of examples to look at and go over. When we're talking about like trans people, you're already talking about like 1% of the general population, 1 to 1.5. So 1 to 1.5% out of 8 billion. And of that group, you're only going to have a certain percentage that reports for these studies. And then of that group, it's only going to be certain studies that she wants to use. And you keep going down this list, and you're going to find that, yeah, there's way less trans people than there are septillions of these particles that you're looking at. So you have tons of examples of particles that you're looking at. And that's how you can get these like very, very stringent, examples or what you're looking at. And again, as Red, I love that you pointed that out. Physics and looking at particles and measuring the universe is not the same thing as asking people about their subjective experience. Trying so hard not to swear right now.
You could use substitutional swear words.
No, I'm fine. I'm just angry that she's making this comparison. It is very it's ridiculous.
And anyways, another thing is that not just there's more particles than there are people in the world, let alone trans people, but also you don't need to really have ethical concerns about mistreating particles. Denying somebody a medicine that they need is an ethical concern. You don't have such thing in physics. As long as you don't do something really stupid like create a black hole, you're pretty much okay in the ethics department.
Right. It's kind of odd that the people that are in the medical discipline and psychology, I guarantee you probably had to take more ethics courses than she did. And it absolutely shows in her unethical approach to this data and this video.
Yeah. I mean, all that physics have to do is like avoid stupid stuff like don't create any black holes. And I could be wrong, but I think there's some physicists who even grumble at that.
Right. And I'm pretty sure that like black holes are perfectly fine at, creating themselves. The universe seems to be a black hole generator. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I'm not impressed. Aren't there any better studies? No, there are not. There are at present no high quality.
Sorry, it is so funny. You might ask, like, aren't I satisfied with these studies? Like, no. Aren't there better quality studies? No. It's like, just say you're angry and move on. Like, you don't have to talk about the subject. There's nothing making her make this video. And yet, look how angry she is about it. It's ridiculous. Like, to get this passionate against the rights of other people, against our existence, is absurd. I'm sorry. She's laughable. At this point, this, like, being like exaggerating, there's no better data that we can find. Oh, okay, fine. Then you just have bad data. I don't know what to tell you. But if you think that there's any data on behalf of rapid onset gender dysphoria, like maybe you should just leave the subject alone because you're already off the reservation.
Quality studies that conclusively demonstrate these treatments are beneficial. The British National Health Service looked at this in 2020 and found evidence from 5 observational studies which suggest that gender-affirming hormones are likely to improve symptoms of gender dysphoria and may also improve depression, anxiety, quality of life, suicidality, and psychological functioning. But they point out that those studies didn't have control groups and that all results were of very low certainty. An often made comparison is that between transgender identity and left-handedness, which was recently popularized by...
I mean, she literally did the exact same thing. She, once again, here's more evidence. Here's another study showing the benefits of, healthcare. And she's like, well, I mean, the results are just inconclusive. I mean, we know what happens to people when they don't get gender-affirming care. They have worse outcomes. It's always going to be that way. The data will always reflect that. And she can just continuously complain that she can't tell. It's unclear. Okay, maybe to her. And maybe she doesn't need gender-affirming care. But for the rest of us that do need gender-affirming care, she should leave us alone. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
Gender identity and left-handedness, which was recently popularized by the British comedian John Oliver. Until the 1970s or so, children were forced to learn to write with their right hand until it occurred to someone to just let them write as they wanted. Rather suddenly, a lot of people switched to writing with the other hand.
If John Oliver were ever on this show, I know how the video would sound. It would be quack, 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 quack,
Right.
quack, 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 quack.
All the F-bombs.
Oh yeah, he loves dropping them.
Rather suddenly, a lot of people switched to writing with the other hand. This had nothing to do with social contagion. It was just that now they could be who they had wanted to be all along. You expect a similar thing to happen with transgender identification, that as it becomes socially more acceptable, you see more people being comfortable being who they really are. And so the argument goes, no one would put themselves or their children through a gender transition if they didn't think it was really necessary. But for one thing, this doesn't explain why the gender ratio of those seeking treatment for gender dysphoria has suddenly changed. And also, as much as I like John Oliver, it's an extremely unfortunate comparison. You can switch a pen from one hand to the other and back within a few seconds and without lasting consequences. Puberty
On the other hand, however, if you're forced from kindergarten to write with your right hand when you're really left-handed, changing at age 30 and learning from scratch how to write with your left hand is not so simple.
Yeah, so she's like referring to it as a social contagion, you know what I mean? I would assume she thinks that...
She's basically suggesting that teaching someone forcing a left-handed person to write with the right hand is super reversible.
Yeah, because you can just be like, oh, like that, or switch it. And she thinks when she mentioned the social contagion, it's like, oh no, now I'm left-handed. I can't stop, and that's why the numbers are going up. No, it's not. And it's also the fact that like comparing something like changing the pens that are in your hand and comparing that to social transition is absolutely ridiculous. And she's like, they're talking about identity, like I identify as a right-handed person or a left-handed person. And the reason why there are more people that are identifying themselves as left-hand is because they can now be free to be themselves as left-handed people instead of having strict social norms enforced on them. Because what she's leaving out is that people were forced to learn to write with their right hand, and they were disciplined or shamed publicly for writing with their left hand, and they were treated as if there was something wrong with them for being left-handed. It's the ontological identification of like identifying as somebody who is left-handed because that's how they are. Not, oh, he's saying it's so easy to, switch your gender that it's as easy as passing a pen back and forth. Obviously it's not. And none of us have said that. That's her strawmanning our side and making this up entirely.
Indeed.
Within a few seconds and without lasting consequences. Puberty blockers and hormone therapies are not as easy to undo, and we don't understand the long-term consequences.
But we do understand the long-term consequences of neglecting treatment.
Yeah, higher, like severe increased rates of depression. Unfortunately, higher rates of anxiety and suicidality. Yeah,
and also much more difficulty socially integrating with the gender that you fit.
Exactly. And then like if you also are going to make people transition later in life, there's also difficulty adjusting, to the transition as you go on, like the later that you go. Obviously, if you're able to transition earlier, it seems to be the case that it can be smoother or quicker because, as you pointed out, you can be integrated into your family correctly or into society correctly a lot faster than making somebody struggle for years living with an external expression that doesn't match who they are, like as I did. And we had a long time of being forced into a gender performance that did not suit us. And it caused us like a lot of, stress and anxiety, depression, everything else. And I've gotten nothing but happier as I have been transitioning to the person that I should have been allowed to be all along.
Indeed.
But the reasonable expectation is that the current increase in reports of gender dysphoria is caused by a mixture of two causes. Young people are more comfortable being openly trans, and some of them erroneously believe they are trans because they've heard so much about it. I'd say that anyone who insists that one of those possibilities doesn't exist is pushing an agenda and shouldn't be taken seriously.
Poisoning the well, aren't we?
I like that she also doesn't mention what percentage of that percent of trans people that she originally listed. She doesn't list what percentage she thinks detransitioners make up. She just says that, well, they could be mistaken. And if you're going to deny this, then you're pushing an agenda. When we've already acknowledged that detransitioners are a thing, this happens to some people, unfortunately, but she leaves out how statistically likely she thinks, like what percentage of all trans teenagers are possibly detransitioners.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget how I'm sure that some of the detransitioners detransition because they realize that the social pressures are more than they can take.
Right. I also want to point out how stupid social contagion theory is. Like, are you serious? So like just making information available to people is more likely going to increase them identifying that way. That's literally what she's implying there. And I'm sorry, but there's all sorts of social categories that I'm aware of. Like, so let's say, I don't know, murderers or something. Just me being aware that there are murderers out there does not increase the chance that other people are going to go and be murderers out there. That's ridiculous. That's literally the social contagion. Like, if somebody has any type of identity, you being exposed to this identity increases your chance of identifying that way as well. And it's like with trans people, it's just that people recognize our experiences in themselves. They realize that there is a community of people out there that feel the same way that they do, and that there is a name for what they're experiencing. And that can be really empowering. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for people's psychological health to also find these groups. And that's true for any type of like neurodivergency, for people of a different gender identity or sexuality. It always helps to be able to find community and people that you can connect with. That's all that's going on. It's not a contagion or anything like that. It's ridiculous.
The question is, how do you tell these two possibilities apart? This is currently unclear, and this is why countries like Sweden, Finland, and the UK are asking doctors to hold back with prescriptions, because at the moment they don't know how to deal with the sudden surge of girls presenting with gender dysphoria.
And I'm sure that the reason for the UK having people hold back on gender-affirming care has nothing to do with the activities of the TERF who shall not be named.
Right, or the entire like gender critical movement that has been inspired by that group, and the general conservative bent that a lot of these governments have taken over the last like 4 or 5 years. And when she's like, well, they just don't know what to do about it. People need healthcare. I need you to make an argument for why they shouldn't have access to their healthcare if that's what you're going to claim. I would say these governments are making a mistake and adding more like gatekeeping to this instead of making it easier for people to get access to the healthcare that they need.
Indeed.
And they don't want to do any harm.
Okay.
Good. So they don't want to harm. So the same governments, I wrote down a couple of points real quick. Well, I guess they're not a couple of points, but I think it's worth mentioning that the same governments that are going to make it harder for people to get access to puberty blockers are the same governments like within the United States right now that are passing loads of anti-LGBT legislation, tons of it. everything from trying to stop us from participating in sports, to denying us healthcare, to denying the existence of LGBT children, banning drag performances, or like male or female impersonators. Like, they are attacking every single portion of our existence in legislation. And she's like, yeah, but the governments are just concerned about puberty blockers. It's like, if that's the only thing they're concerned about, I think that the laws that they're trying to pass would not reflect this.
Anyways, one area where there's a lot of hostility toward transgender people is in the southern United States. And over there, one person that's trying to get out of there is Alfred. And he because Alfred is one trans person who's trapped in the southern United States and is needing help getting out. So here I have on the screen the QR code for his GoFundMe. Please visit Alfred's GoFundMe if you have the spare money to help him get out of the southern United States. Again, I totally understand if you don't have the money, that kind of money, but if you do, please help Alfred. You could very well be saving a life. Anything to add there, Zoe?
No, I'll say that as a community, it's always good to support one another. And this would be like another one of those examples where someone is in need. So if we have the ability to, then please donate to Alfred and to help someone escape the South.
And I would also like to mention another charity, A Place for Marcia, a group which is in general trying to help 18-year-old and older transgender people escape to states that treat trans rights as the human rights they are. Anything to add?
I'll say that all these charities are always for good cause. And right now, LGBT charities, so you mentioned A Place for Marcia. I would also mention Trevor Project. Like, any donation that people can make toward the LGBT community right now would be very helpful, as there are lots of people out there that need help.
Send me a link to the Trevor Project then.
Yeah.
You've got we're connected in Discord. You'll send me a message there.
Yeah. And we'll put a link in, we'll put a link somewhere.
Yeah. And anyways, I should mention now that the opinions expressed by my guests are not necessarily the opinions expressed by my guests are not necessarily my opinions, nor are they necessarily the opinions of my cat Amber, or of the monster hovering over my bed, or of the gremlin possessing my elevator. And for that matter, even my own opinions at the time of me making a video are not necessarily my own opinions at a later time. And until next time, see ya.
Bye. It was a lot of fun.